Without further ado, it's my terrific pleasure to introduce Mimi Onuoha. She's an artist and researcher examining the implications of data collection and computational categorization. Her work uses code, writing, and sculpture to explore missing data and the ways in which people are abstracted, represented, and classified. She's presently, or was presently, a visiting faculty member in the Division of Visual and Performing Arts at Bennington College, where she was teaching courses in impossible maps and a philosophy of data. Based in Brooklyn, Onuoha has been an artist in residence at Eyebeam Art and Technology Center, Data and Society Research Institute, and many other places. So without further ado, it's my terrific pleasure to introduce Mimi Onuoha.
Hey, everyone. Hello. Okay, so this is going to be really interesting. I was telling Golan, I'm at this weird moment right now in my practice where I'm kind of switching things that I've been doing up to like something new. And so rather than hiding that and just like talking about old stuff or pretending like that's not the case, I just am going to be very explicit and kind of work through that with all of you. So, as I said, my name is Mimi, and most of my work has to do with the implications of data collection, or more specifically, it has to do with making visible the implications of data collection. And the nice thing about being at a place like here at CMU is that I don't really have to like go too deep into that, because I think a lot of you probably know what I mean when I talk about data collection. I mean how we collect more data now. I see nods. Cool, we collect more data now than we ever have. More and more things are automated, from our cars to just social decisions. For things to be automated, we need data to feed into them. That's the reality of the world. So we have this need to turn the world into data. So all of you, I think, are generally kind of aware of this. That's great. You might not know sort of what led to this, like some of the origins. And there are a lot of starting places that you can choose, but the one that I really like to focus on is in 1929. And it is this moment when we first had like an example of this idea that you could systematically collect data about people in the world and use that to inform your understandings of people in the world. And that comes from Helen Merrill Lind, who's sitting in this, her and Robert Lind. There are no good photos of Robert, but there's this great one of Helen, so we use her. And so 1929, Robert and Helen Merrill Lind, they travel to Muncie, Indiana. So it's a town in Indiana. And they went there and they tracked this assortment of facts and statistics and trends about the daily lives of all of these citizens in Muncie for over a year. They did that, and then they published this huge study that was called Middletown. And it wasn't the first time that something like this had been done, but it was probably the most ambitious effort in the sense that they spent so long there working and gathering this data about the trends and so on of all the people in this town. And it ended up having this huge reach, and it went the 20th century version of viral, which is like people wanting to read it at the library, and like newspapers writing about it, and it caused this big commotion. And I think part of that has to do with the name of it, Middletown. That idea, this moment sort of represents the germination of a couple ideas. And so one of these ideas is that there's this prototypical town that you can use to understand the rest of us. And this is for the US. And this is something that we just take for granted now, but at the time that was crazy. Nobody had really believed in that before. And yet this thing came out, and this was a big moment for that idea. But then there's kind of this second, more subtle idea, which is that if you're given the right scientific mindset and tools and methods of data collection, you can begin to explore what it means to make people into these objects of data collection. So, as you can tell, I'm very inspired in some ways by this report. I learned about it when I was in college. And if you're interested in it, there's this great book that talks about it. It's called The Averaged American, which I think is very clever as a title. And it's written by Susan E. Igoe. And this book is great because it really goes into all of the details of the Middletown report, and it talks about this idea of, again, this sense of a we, using the part to generalize and explore the whole, and that idea of people believing that. And it talks all about the ramifications of this. So this book does that, and it's really great, but it took me a real long time to actually read it, even though it was about this study that I had heard about, and I knew about the book, but I actually don't even have a good reason for why I didn't read this, to be honest. I knew about the book. I had heard about Middletown, and I felt very inspired by Robert and Helen Merrill Lind. I was inspired by the fact that they were doing this investigation into data collection in a rigorous fashion in a way that wasn't at all popular, and then that ended up kind of starting a lot of other things. But I didn't read this book about it for a long time. And if you had asked me why, I probably would have just said that I was busy. I don't know. I would have said I was busy doing work. And this is the work that I did, as Golan read so nicely in that bio. I'm an artist, or maybe more of an artist, and I tend to work in a lot of different fields. And so these are a lot of titles of different positions that I've held, or that I use depending on who I'm talking to and the space that I'm in. And so I do a lot of different things, but almost everything I do still involves working with data collection in some way. And usually, I like making these creative interrogations into data collection. So what do I mean by creative interrogation into data collection? I will show you an example since you asked. So this is this project called Pulse. It's from about almost exactly 2 years ago. And this is a performance, actually. It was a performance that I did. And in this performance, what I did, is this playing? Yeah, cool. In this performance, I strapped this heart rate monitor to myself and set up a microcontroller so I could collect the data from it, and set it up over Bluetooth so that I could just have my heart data. But I didn't just collect that data, even though the sensor is very good. It's very, very sensitive, as I found out. And I didn't just collect it. I actually broadcast that data to this room of 300 people as I was interacting with them. So the idea is that they could interact with me, and they could also have this really strange window into my heart, my pulse, and how it was reacting. And like I said, the sensor was really, really sensitive, so you could see very much how it would change. So this was just this one-off performance that I was going to do. I kind of was like, this is cool, I'm just gonna do this as one thing. I didn't really want to document it, just wanted to kind of explore it in that moment. And as often happens, you can't plan what's gonna happen with these things. But about 10 minutes after I put on the heartbeat sensor, I got this text message from this person who I was dating, breaking up with me. Which, no, it's cool, it's fine now. We could have a whole other talk about breaking up with people over text message, but we won't do that, not today, next time. So I got this message from someone, broke up with me, and had this really strange moment where all of a sudden, it just, for me, elevated the stakes of everything I was doing, in the sense that I was like, oh my gosh, now I have my heart on this wall. You can actually see how I feel. And it just, it just felt like this very visceral experience. And towards the end of it, so some of my friends knew about this, and I remember this because I remember putting it on, and I remember getting this message and being like, oh, whatever, I don't even care. And they weren't even looking at me, they were just looking at the wall. And they were like, oh, you do care, we can tell. But this thing happened afterwards, which is that some of my friends didn't know. And so when I told them what had happened, one of them said this thing to me, and she was like, you really hid your stress. She's like, you really hid that well. And I thought that was wild, because in fact, I hadn't hid it. I had projected it on the wall so that everybody could see it. But there is something that she was getting at, which is that I hadn't hidden that data, but of course I had hidden the context for the data and the terms of collection for the data. And as we all know, showing data when you're not showing the context behind it can remove a great deal of the meaning behind it. And in many ways, this feels very obvious, but is somehow also extremely, extremely easy to forget. But I am not the first person to say this. Golan mentioned some of the classes that I teach. In many of the classes I teach, I have my students read a selection from this book, Protocol, by Alexander Galloway, who is a programmer and a professor media theorist at NYU. And there's this part in the book where he says, many media formats have a tendency to conceal their own making. So he uses a lot of different examples when he talks about this. The first one that he really uses is old film. So he talks about classic Hollywood film. And it's this really big thing in classic Hollywood film. You are not supposed to see any of the apparati that are responsible for creating the image. They're deliberately removed. So nothing is allowed to be there, nothing is allowed to call attention to the illusory nature of the medium and how it actually works. So this is an example. The commodity conceals its own making. If any of you have heard of the internet, anyone hasn't? Just try, it's good to ask. It's a similar concept with the internet. I'm sure most of you intimately are acquainted with it, but I bet that you rarely think about the undersea cables and underground cables that actually make up the physical infrastructure of it and are absolutely necessary and crucial to us actually being able to use it. Tim Berners-Lee actually has this great quote about this. Tim Berners-Lee, in case you don't know, is the developer of the web. And he's got this wonderful quote where he says, "The job of computers and networks is to get out of the way, to not be seen." So the technology should be transparent. We should interact with it intuitively. And while we're talking about the web also gives us lots of good examples of this. If any of you have ever written any HTML, any markup, this is a website. It's called, what is it? Ismycomputeron.com. The answer is always yes. And even for a website as simple as this, you can see on the side that you can tell, the one with the code, the one with the HTML. That's actually how these pages are rendered, or how these pages are created, but they're actually rendered as these browser pages. So once again, you have this thing where it's being concealed. The medium conceals its own making. And once you start to think about this, you'll see it everywhere. Everywhere you go, you'll start seeing how commodities and media formats actually conceal their own making. And of course, if you read more in the book, Galloway talks a little bit more about this. He talks about how this is in the pursuit of continuity and in the pursuit of fluidity, and that we need this in order to be able to just use things and have that experience be very seamless and easy. We have to do this trade-off, which we trade the ease of use for knowing the inner workings. So we trade that intuition for the disruption of having to think about how something is actually produced. And that is not necessarily a bad or a good thing, but it's just a trade-off that we make constantly. And so the question then is, what does this have to do with data collection? And as you might have guessed, data sets are the exact same way. So data sets also conceal their own making. They conceal their own source. And this is a really important point because, as I said before, maybe a lot of you here work with data. You may not realize it, but every time you work with a data set, you make this trade-off in the same way. So you make the trade-off of not having to consider the background of it if you're just going to work with it the way that it is handed to you. And you make that trade-off of not having to consider any of the context. But it is a very, very, very important thing to remember. This idea that data sets are the results of their means of collection, and that those means of collection are normally hidden. So I'll give another example of this. I mentioned before, I do a lot of things. One of the things that I was doing for quite a while was being a data journalist at Quartz, which is this business site. And this is a thing I did there. You should know, journalists don't really get to choose the headlines for articles, which is why sometimes you read an article and you're like, that's fantastic. And then you see the headline and you're like, that doesn't make sense. They're not always chosen by the same person. So this article is titled, "Side-by-Side Images Expose a Glitch in Google's Maps," which is what it's about, very, very concretely. And so what this is talking about is how, for all, as it says, for the vast amounts of location-based data that Google has, there are still places that are impossible for the company to map. And we know this because we can see it. We can see it in satellite and aerial imagery. So here's an example. This is Morro dos Prazeres. I'm sure I said that wrong. It's a favela in the heart of Rio. And so you can see on the right-hand side, those are favelas. You put our slider over, and you can see that none of them, they don't show up anymore. Here's another one that's close to my heart because it's in Lagos. This is Makoko. It's this floating lake community. It's off the coast of Lagos, which is a huge city in Nigeria. And it is it's this lagoon settlement. Estimates say that there are about 100,000 people there, but it actually could be far, far more. And this one and the real one I've seen in person, and I have to say it's very wild being there because you can see, sometimes it's hard to make sense of these numbers. 100,000 people, what does that look like? It's huge. So many people live in these spaces, and you can see that they're not represented really in the geodata. Here's another example. This is from Chad's Lake Feetry drainage basin, which has its own huge story behind it in terms of humanitarian work. And there's not really any maps for this area. And this is just a large crisis because it makes it hard for anybody to really navigate it. And this one is wild because this is a huge area, home to almost 2 million people. And of course, once again, you can't really see them on the map. And I think you're getting the idea now. Here's another one. This is from the Gobi Desert. And once again, doesn't really show up. So part of this is because, like I said, collecting the satellite imagery is easy-ish, if you have a satellite. in plane. Aerial imagery, it's raster. You can just take the photo. But geodata takes a lot more to collect. I teach a class on mapping, and it's really interesting working with the students and getting them to create their own maps where you have to collect your own data. It's so much work. It's so much work, and it's a form of data. It's geodata. It can be put in normal or typical models for data sheets. It's GeoJSON as a format, but it takes a lot more work to map it. And so this, I think, is just so interesting because what's happening here isn't anything malicious. There's nothing, it's not like Google is trying not to represent these places. It's not that anybody is trying to erase anybody. It's just that the nature of the spaces resists the modes of collection. So the question is, what do you do with that? And that is really what I have been thinking about for a long time. And so if we rewind a bit, we can then generate this fact, I would say, which is that as we collect data, we prioritize things that fit existing patterns of collection. So the data we have will always be a result of the ways in which we are able to collect that data. And so this story we were just talking about, that we're telling about the favelas, is a story of legibility in a way. It's a story of places that are not actually legible. And this is what I mean when I talk about the implications of data collection and of this world that's made collectible, and specifically of a world where things are rendered more and more through data. This is exactly what I'm talking about, is what are these strange things that result from it? And they're not always malicious or intentional, but they result from this fact that everything that we collect is completely a result of the way that it is being collected. And of course, it forces us to then ask this question, which is, what do you do with the things that don't fit your modes of collection? So I told you in the beginning, I'm walking you through how things have changed, the research that I'm thinking of. And so we're not there, we're not at the new part yet. But I will tell you, a few years ago when I was thinking about all of this, and I was wondering, what do we do with these things that do not fit our modes of collection? I thought it might be smart to go back to Middletown. Part of this is because, when you're looking for answers, I think it always makes sense to look back to see what people did before, but also because Helen and Robert Lind they were operating at a time where they weren't using these devices, so they weren't getting any of the benefits of automation, but they also didn't have any of the drawbacks of it. And so I wondered, what were their solutions in these moments? What do they do for the things that did not fit their modes of collection? How did they approach their data? What can I draw from them? What can I learn from them? And so what that meant was that I finally ended up reading this book, which was great. It was very enlightening. It was enlightening, but not necessarily in the way that I expected. So I read about the Linds, and I learned more about them. I learned more about the reasons why they wanted to do things. The Linds were advocates. They really did want a more just world. They believed very, very strongly in the ability of being able to collect this data and how collecting that data would make the world more fair, which feels crazy to think about now in the post-Cambridge Analytica era, which is that they did very strongly believe in that. They felt that very earnestly. And so, but they were also scientists. And so there's this quote from the book that I read, this is from Robert. He says, "Since we are attempting a difficult new technique in a highly complicated field, it is desirable to simplify our situation as far as possible." So the Linds were scientists. They understood that they needed to simplify, they needed to eliminate what was peripheral, what was unnecessary. They were very interested in this. And so in a way, they kind of did have to deal with their own idea of things that don't fit the mode of collection, coming from a different point of view. But the thing that really surprised me was that it turned out that for the Linds, these peripheral complicating factors could actually be people, but only certain people. This is a quote from the book. "For the Linds, Muncie's African Americans and immigrants were, in social scientific terms, complicating factors, not constitutive components of the community." All right, so to just give us a step back, we have this moment when this idea of people being collectible is being formed. And in this moment, when we're having this small group represent everyone, not actually everyone is being represented. And at the time, when I first kind of had this realization, real talk, it kind of gutted me, because I thought I'd seen something of myself in them, and it was sort of this distancing moment where I was like, oh, that is not really true. In retrospect, I don't think I should have been surprised. And what it did was it gave me a completely different way of approaching thinking about these things. And specifically, when it came to answering this question, what do you do with the things that don't fit your modes of collection? It helped me see that there was actually a different kind of structure that was behind it. And what I mean by that are these patterns of absence, this is what I started to understand, is that absence actually is not just a gaping nothing. There are patterns to the things that we don't collect. So this is a project, another project I've been working on. This project I've been working on since about 2015, I think, and have just been working on it ever since, still working on it right now. And it is called Missing Datasets. And I have a GitHub repo about this. I have a history. One of the things I really like to do is use GitHub for things that GitHub is not designed for. GitHub is, for anyone who doesn't know, GitHub is a code sharing website. And so I like to use it for teaching. I like to use it for writing. I like to use it for projects. I have a lot of things up on GitHub. And one of the things I have is this project on missing data sets. And I call missing data sets blank spots in otherwise data saturated spaces. So you'll have these spaces where loads and loads of data is being collected, and then you will have this very curious blank spot where there is nothing at all that's being collected. And I have dozens, like hundreds and hundreds of these missing data sets that I have been collecting. So the list, this is actually a really old list. Some of these have changed, but some examples are the number of Latinx people in Florida's prisons. That data is not collected. Number of stingrays being used by police departments. Stingrays are cell phone surveillance devices, essentially. Data, public access to the financial data Wall Street's models run off of, the number of Tor relays that are run by the NSA and GCHQ, there are a lot, we don't know how many. So I collect these data sets, and I collect them on my own in my own format, but I also have this art piece that I make that is called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And so this is a shot of the Library of Missing Data Sets in New York when I most recently showed it. And this filing cabinet. In the filing cabinet, there are folders. Each folder is titled with the name of a missing data set. And so it's really nice to actually see people interact with this, because there's this great moment where people actually lift up the folders and open it, and then they realize there's nothing in the folders because they're missing data, and it kind of clicks for them, and that's just great. It's great to see that moment happen. And as this piece travels, it changes. And so the things that are in it are not necessarily always in it. And it's, at this point, been shown in a lot of different countries. And wherever it's shown, I try to make the missing data sets really match up with the location of where it is. And so the piece exists, and it's a great way for people to be able to interact with this in a very physical, tangible sort of way. But like I said, what is far more interesting to me are the patterns behind the piece. The data sets, I think, are actually, they're the artifacts of something more, like I said, something a little bit more interesting, a little bit deeper. So those patterns are sort of the reasons why things are missing, and there are really 4 that I have traditionally highlighted. First of these reasons, that's why you have a missing data set, is that those who have the resources to have data might not have the incentives. And the very first missing data set that I started out with was civilians killed by the police. And that, to me, was such a good example of this exact principle, which is that there's a force that very easily could have collected that data, because they actually create that data set. And so to collect it would not be that hard, but did not have the incentive to collect that. And whereas there was another group of people who did have the incentive, but didn't have the resources to get that data. However, I will say this is no longer a missing data set. This has actually been filled, but the amount of work that it's taken and the number of different groups that have had to come together to collect this tell us just about this unbalance of resources and incentives and how big that can be. And similarly, there are lots of examples. You can kind of sort all of these missing data into this. I would say that in the Pulse project that I described earlier, this is also an example of this, where I had the resource. I had the ability to tell people exactly what I was responding to, but I didn't. I did not have any incentive to do that, which is to say that this is what I mean when I say that this is a pattern for it, that there are multiple things that can fit into this, and they fall all along different levels of kind of seriousness, but also just an import. But it kind of tells us about where things are grouped. So here's another one, which is that the act of collection takes more than it gives. This is one when I think about the lens, when I think about the Muncie report. This, to me, is a perfect example of that, where they found that the act of collecting this data from the African Americans and from the immigrants in the community, they thought that the work to deal with that took far more than what it would actually give the data. And what's great about, I say great, but not like in a good way, if you know what I mean. What's interesting really about that is that it tells us about where your focus lies and what's important to you. Because this is not necessarily always just black and white. Another really, really sort of powerful example of this is traditionally data around sexual harassment. The burden of having to come forward and report takes so much that in many cases, for a lot of people, it's not worth it until there's sort of a critical mass for a lot of people. Here's the third one, which is that often data resist metrification. So this, I think, if we look at the example of Google Maps that I was showing, those spaces, they are spaces that resist metrification, which is interesting. They're physical places, again, and so that's why I think it's so important to bring up this fact that it's not that somebody's against it, it's not that somebody's being malicious, but that these spaces resist the modes of collection. And cache. Cache is another great example. There's nobody knows how much US cash is around, is just floating around. Nobody knows it all. And there have been a lot of attempts. I've spoken with a lot of people and researchers who try to kind of get this number and can make these estimates, and they're always like, we just really don't know. But the form itself resists metrification. Cache is such, there's a lot to be said about cache. And then the final one is benefits to nonexistence. And whenever I used to talk about this one, this is kind of a tricky one in the sense that it kind of overlaps with a few of the other ones that I have described. You could see it overlapping even in the examples that I've given, like with the first one, this idea of incentives and so on. But usually the way that I mean it is in regards to people who are situationally disadvantaged. And so when I say that, I mean, I've spent a lot of time working with undocumented people in New York, or spent a bit of time working with undocumented people in New York who were having issues with the restaurant industry and didn't want to say anything because they felt like to actually say something could endanger them. And so there was a benefit for them of not actually being represented in any kind of data set. They didn't want to appear in any kind of database. I told you before that I create this library of missing data sets, but even beyond that, this project has sort of expanded and turned into a lot of different things. And so one thing that I do is I work with people who sometimes have missing data. And the story I always like to tell is from this group. So if there are any Broadway fans in the room, which I'm not gonna make you raise your hand, don't worry, but any Broadway fans, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but there traditionally has been no data on the ethnicity of performers on the stage in Broadway. There is lots of data on the demographics of audience members, but they say that that's different. And so this is a group of Asian American performers, and they had this sense many years ago that they were actually being discriminated against when it came to roles compared to some of their colleagues. But they had no proof, and so when they tried to talk to people about it, nobody believed them. And so they embarked on this mission. They spent 5 years gathering data. And because they themselves were performers, they actually knew the scene really well. And so it was not easy, but they were able to kind of create this complete data set and actually get all this information. And so they did this. They spent years doing this. And then I joined them towards the very end of it and helped them with some of the analysis stuff, because it turns out performers are so fantastic, but they do not know how to work with data at all. They were like, here's some napkin. They were like, the first year we took notes on napkins, and I was like, y'all, we can't use that data. We're not gonna use that year. But so we gathered this data. We told you we spent 5 years doing that. And then I wrote this piece up for it, did some analysis of it, wrote a piece about it. And then we did some various charts and visualizations about it. And this is the most simple one, but I think the best one. And this is just the race and ethnicity of actors in the 2014 to 15 season. Asian Americans are the light blue color. So you can see, deeply underrepresented on the stage. And this is sort of a tangent that I think is quite interesting in dealing with the data, is that actually you start to see the way that inclusion unfolds on Broadway is very much related to shows. So you can see there's always like a black show, there's like, and this is like the Asian show down at the bottom, The King and I, which the main characters are not even Asian. So anyway, that's interesting. The only couple shows that broke that were Rent and Hamilton, which is interesting. But so this kind of showed exactly what they were saying, It was exactly the thing that they were talking about, which is that they felt like this wasn't true, and then they were able to collect this data, had this missing data set, now they have it. And it was sort of this very easy, cut and dry situation, which is not always the case, I will say. But with them, it worked out very nicely in that sense. And so, but working with them and working with other people kind of has made me start to question this idea of making visible the implications of data collection, which is a thing that I told you that I have been setting out to do, because I find myself asking, visible to whom? And what I mean by that is, this is Pun. He's my main point of contact with the performers. Pun was very much already aware of the issues around the lack of data for the Broadway actors. He already knew what was going on. He knew what the data was going to say. He and his group needed to collect it as a form of proof. They needed to be able to bring it to stakeholders in the theater scene. But in fact, and the data was right, and they collected, I can verify they collected it very soundly. But even still, who are you, who does this need to be made visible to? I told you before about the Brazil and the favelas. The way that story came about, this is in Portuguese, so don't worry if you can't read it. The way that story came about is that when Pokemon Go first came out, nobody in the favelas could play. And the reason for that is because the underlying data for Pokemon Go comes from Google. And like I said, I showed you the places that don't show up on the map, so then they weren't represented in the data for the game. So this is actually how that story came out. And what it has caused me to think about is how hidden things don't really stay hidden. They resurface. They just resurface in other ways and in other places. And there's this funny thing happening at this moment right now, is that we have this moment where more data is being collected than ever before, and it's being fed into various algorithms that are being used for various social determinations that weren't necessarily existing before. And all of a sudden, those things are showing the algorithmic proof of those failings. And so a lot of the work that I have been doing has been in identifying things that happen at the point of data collection. And the point for that, for me, has been that, there's some kind of significance to this down the line, and that you see this. And it feels a little bit like we're in that moment where you are seeing that in a way. And I'll explain this a little bit more and kind of talk about how I got to this. This is the part I mean when I said things are shifting in the work. So recently, or I guess not as recently, in November, I attended this symposium in Rio. This is why I keep talking about Brazil. And it was this artificial intelligence and inclusion symposium. And it was nice in the sense that it brought together people from all over the world. And there have been, in recent times, a lot of different symposiums, events, and conferences that have to do with AI and inclusion and fairness and transparency when it comes to algorithms and et cetera, machine learning. And this one was unique in that it was based in the Global South. So that was sort of a very interesting thing about it. And something I had to do for this event was give a talk about creativity and AI. And afterwards, I was on this panel, and this woman asked me this question, where she said, all of you are here, you're doing this event, it's on AI and inclusion. We had been there for days, and then this was really just the final. At the end of the day, we had this one event that was for the public. And she said, okay, you're doing this event, it's for the public. After this event, what are we supposed to do? What about us? What's our role? Is this what inclusion is for y'all? You just have this event, and then you talk to us at the end, and then we leave? And so the way that they did the questions is that they asked multiple people to ask a question, and then we all sat, and then we could choose which questions we answered, and nobody answered her question. And that stayed with me for so long after, that the reason no one answered is because they didn't really have an answer for her. And I ended up thinking a lot about that and following up. I wasn't able to talk to her, but I ended up following up with a lot of people who did know her. And what they started mentioning was that it feels like there's something different about this moment that we're in right now. And it feels like we're in this moment where these strange implications of data collection are making themselves explicit in things that we're saying. And so what they were referring to were things like this, which maybe you've seen, which this is this case of this man not being, the photo that he uploaded was not recognized because it said his eyes are closed, when in fact his eyes are open. This is another example of this, which is this beauty contest. It's judged by AI, and the robots didn't like dark skin. There are legions and legions of examples of these. There's one about, I don't even like to show all of them, but there's one that has to do with Black people being seen as gorillas when they're uploaded in and the Google's image recognition systems and so on. They're all of these things. And what they do is they kind of show the algorithmic effects of this bias and of these holes, these spaces in lack of data collection from before that I was talking about. And so we've always had these realities of data not being collected. And we've always had these moments where companies have more power over data. And we've always had this knowledge that entities could have reasons to not be transparent about the data that they're collected. But as this algorithmic decision making is becoming more pervasive, now we see the outputs of that. And it shows that these things do not stay hidden, they just resurface in other ways. And so it makes me think about these implications. The implications of data collection are becoming more visible. And so the work that I have been doing in trying to make visible these implications seems increasingly somehow ill-suited in a way, or it almost seems like I need to be switching the focus. And so now I'm like, well, how do we make sense of this? How do we demystify this? How do we give people a say in the terms of collection? And this is the part, like I said, moving into a new space. I don't know exactly. Don't know what the answer to this is. I have a lot of things that I am working on, though, and I can tell you about some of those. So some of this, I talked about demystification. These, I got a lot of books and zines. So this is one that I've made in the past. This is a collaboration with Zara Rahman. This zine was called Inform Transform. This zine was released, I think, last year, and it's about the 9 ways in which data can be transformed and manipulated and shaped. I think you can kind of see it in that top corner. And we've now translated it. The green one is German, the blue one is French. There's a Spanish one that's coming. And this was the idea behind this was that we were like, okay, well, again, how do we take this and stop? Both of us have been in spaces with lots of experts who are talking about these things, but how do you open up this conversation? How do you open it up to people? And so from that, currently working on this, which is called The People's Guide to AI, which I'm working on with Diana Nucera, who's a wonderful, based in Detroit, sort of activist organizer and techno something. Just a lot of things. And this one, I don't have any photos of because we are literally in the middle of working on it. We've got a grant, and it originally was a zine and now has grown so large that it has turned into like a book. And so it might just be published. We'll see. And part of this involves lots of workshops. We're actually sitting down with people and doing these different workshops that are meant to help get across these different ideas that have to do with AI. So that's one thing I've been working on. Another thing is this is a project that's just a piece. It's called Null Set. And this is actually a sculpture. This is just a rendering of it because this piece is, again, I told you everything's in the middle of happening, is about to be installed. And this are these brackets. And the thing part of this has to do with this. There's a whole manifesto that accompanies this in a piece of writing, and it has to do with this idea of classification. And like I said, like in the bio, I talked about the ways that people are classified and abstracted, and how at the heart of a lot of the things that we talk about is this need to classify things and to categorize. And so this piece gets at this in a way. It's these neon brackets. They're pretty big. They're like 6 feet. They hang up. They're programmed, and they light up, and they group people in different ways when people come up and interact with the piece. So one thing, this is a much larger project, which is around this idea of algorithmic violence. And so this, like I said, it gets at, what this comes from is from thinking that it seems like we need a word that refers to all of these strange things that have been happening lately, or everything about the lack of control that people can have over these algorithmic services. And so this is sort of the short definition. There's a much longer one. Refers to the violence that an algorithm or automated decision-making system inflicts by preventing people from meeting their basic needs. A long time ago, this idea of structural violence was coined. And what I think is really important is that in these discussions of algorithms and the harm that they can create, that we don't ever lose sight of the fact that all of these algorithms are built upon an existing structure that has its own issues, or an existing societal structure has its own issues. And so, once again, on GitHub, like I said, I like putting things on GitHub that shouldn't be there. So have this whole thing, which is a beginning at fleshing out this idea of what algorithmic violence really means and what it looks like. And it goes into all of these things. It talks about examples that are really small, like when the algorithm for Facebook changes, and all of a sudden, all of these publications can't make money because Facebook is where they get most of their traffic. But it goes to bigger things like all sorts of things, like talking about Facebook again, Facebook's pronouns, when they were forcing people, or names, when Facebook had a lot of issues around this, and just all sorts of things. And the idea, I think, is that if we can have a word to talk about this stuff, then we can begin to actually talk about responding to it in various ways. And so if we can sum that up, then that can do some work for us. And so those are recent things. There are a lot more. But all of these, I think, go in the sense of demystifying, giving people a say in these terms of collection, and moving from this space of just revealing it to actually creating ways for people to do something with that. And to be completely honest with all of you, I do not know exactly where that will lead. But I do know, and this is a conversation I was having with some people, I think yesterday, is that whenever you have an emerging technology, you get a small window of time where you get to decide what decisions around its use are going to be. And once that window of time is over, then it becomes, that source is concealed. And whatever you decide just becomes the way that it is. This is the exact same thing that we're talking about with data sets, with forms of media. And so if we're in that moment right now, then we have to be figuring out ways to decide that, because once we do, it will end. It will just, and whatever we decide will become the way that things are, and that will become erased. So if you're interested in this, if this is something that you find fascinating, then you should absolutely reach out to me, because it is the thing that I'm going to be exploring for the next who knows how long. Thank you all.